There is a particular kind of stuck that has nothing to do with willpower. A person can be intelligent, careful, and genuinely trying, and still find themselves circling the same decision, the same relationship, the same unfinished project, for reasons that have very little to do with the facts in front of them. The mind, it turns out, runs on shortcuts it built long before any of us were born, and most of the time those shortcuts serve us well. But 50 times over, in 50 different corners of ordinary life, they quietly work against the very person they are supposed to protect. Some of what is coming will feel uncomfortably familiar, a habit of thought you will recognize before the sentence describing it is even finished. Some of it explains why a smart group of people can make a worse decision than any one of them would have made alone, or why a single harsh comment can outweigh a week of genuine praise, or why telling yourself not to think about something is one of the most reliable ways to keep thinking about it. None of these are stories about being foolish. They are stories about being human, built by evolution for a world that mostly no longer exists, still running quietly underneath a modern one. There is no need to hurry through them. Settle in. This is the kind of list that rewards patience, because each trap on its own is small, and it is only in seeing all 50 side by side that the shape of the whole thing becomes clear. A woman has put 4 years and a great deal of money into a graduate program she stopped enjoying somewhere around year 2. She is not staying because she believes it will get better. She is staying because leaving would mean admitting that 4 years and a great deal of money are simply gone. This is the sunk cost fallacy, and it is one of the oldest traps in human decision-making, because it feels, in the moment, like loyalty rather than error. The logic of the trap is almost embarrassingly simple once it is named. Money, time or effort already spent cannot be recovered by any decision made from this point forward. Whether she leaves the program today or leaves it in another 2 years, those 4 years are equally gone either way. The only real question left is whether the next 4 years, the ones still available to choose, are worth spending. But the mind resists that clean framing because abandoning a project feels like declaring the investment worthless, and admitting that feels like admitting something about the self who made the investment. Economists have watched this play out in boardrooms deciding whether to keep funding a failing product line, in gamblers chasing losses at a table, and in governments continuing wars whose original justification has long since evaporated, all reasoning from the same broken logic that the size of the hole already dug is a reason to keep digging rather than a reason to stop. Businesses have a phrase for it, throwing good money after bad, though the pattern is really about identity as much as money, a reluctance to let a past self's choice be revealed as a mistake. What makes the trap so durable is that it hides behind a virtue. Persistence is, in most contexts, genuinely admirable. The trouble is telling apart persistence towards something still worth having from persistence that has quietly become only about not admitting a loss. The 4 years spent are not a debt to be honoured, they are simply spent. She will, most likely, finish the program regardless of what any of this explains to her. In a busy Vienna cafe sometime in the 1920s, a psychologist named Bluma Zygarnik noticed something odd about the waiters. They could recall in precise detail every order still owed to a table that had not yet paid. The moment the bill was settled, the memory of that order dissolved almost immediately. Curious, she brought the observation into the laboratory and confirmed it. Unfinished tasks lodge in memory with a stubbornness that finished ones simply do not have. What came to be called the Zygarnik effect explains a great deal about the low background hum of modern attention. An email drafted but not sent, a book abandoned at the 2/3 mark, a conversation left on an unresolved note, all of these keep a small tab open in the mind, consuming quiet processing power until they are either completed or deliberately closed. Some psychologists now believe this is why to-do lists work at all, not because writing something down helps you remember it, but because writing it down and knowing it is captured somewhere gives the mind permission to stop guarding it. Advertisers and storytellers exploit the same mechanism deliberately. A television episode that ends mid-crisis, a serialized story that stops at exactly the wrong moment, both are engineering the same open loop that kept those Viennese waiters awake to unpaid orders. The tension of the unfinished thing is not incidental to the design, it is the entire design. The trap in daily life is subtler than any cliffhanger. A person juggling a dozen half-finished projects is not simply disorganized. They are, in a real sense, carrying a dozen small unresolved tabs, each one quietly siphoning a little attention away from whatever is directly in front of them. The mind does not distinguish between an open loop worth finishing and one that should simply be abandoned outright. It treats both the same, as unfinished business demanding to be watched. The waiters are long gone, and the cafe too. The unpaid order they remembered is still in its way, being remembered somewhere in someone else's unfinished thing. Try, for the next 10 seconds, not to think about a white bear. Notice what happens. For most people, the bear arrives almost immediately, summoned by the very instruction meant to banish it. This small experiment, first run formally by psychologist Daniel Wegner in the 1980s, gave a name to something anyone who has ever tried to fall asleep by commanding themselves to stop worrying already knew from the inside. Ironic process theory describes the mechanism behind it. Suppressing a thought requires two separate mental operations running at once. One that searches for anything related to the banned thought so it can be steered away from, and one that tries to steer attention elsewhere entirely. The trouble is that the first operation, the search, keeps the forbidden thought active and available even while the second operation is trying to bury it. Under normal conditions, the steering usually wins. Under stress, fatigue, or heavy mental load, the searching operation gets the upper hand, and the very thing being suppressed pushes through more forcefully than if it had never been suppressed at all. This explains a strange and common frustration. A person anxious about insomnia who commands themselves to stop thinking about sleep will often find sleep more elusive, not less. A person on a diet who resolves to stop thinking about the dessert in the refrigerator finds it occupying more of their attention than it would have if they had simply eaten a small piece and moved on. A jealous partner instructed to stop imagining a scenario will often imagine it in greater and more vivid detail. Wegner's own research extended the finding to obsessive thoughts more broadly, suggesting that some of what looks like intrusive rumination is not a symptom of a thought being too powerful to control, but a symptom of control itself, applied clumsily, working against its own aim. The bear, in other words, was never really the problem. The order not to think about it was: offer a person a coin flip. Heads, they win $100. Tails, they lose $100. Mathematically, the bet is perfectly fair. Almost nobody takes it. Ask them why, and most will say some version of the same thing, that losing the 100 would simply hurt more than winning it would feel good, even though the numbers on both sides of the bet are identical. This asymmetry is the foundation of what Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky named loss aversion, one of the central findings of the field they built together, called behavioral economics. Careful experiments across decades have repeatedly found the same rough ratio that a loss registers with roughly twice the psychological weight of an equivalent gain. It is not that people dislike losing more than they like winning as a matter of taste. It appears to be closer to a built-in setting of how the mind values change at all. The consequences ripple far beyond coin flips and casinos. Homeowners hold on to a property through a falling market long after the numbers say sell, because selling would convert an abstract paper loss into a real felt one. Investors keep failing stocks rather than realizing the loss on paper. People stay in careers, relationships and cities that no longer serve them, because leaving feels like an active loss, while staying, however quietly corrosive, never quite registers as one. The frame matters more than the substance. Doing nothing and losing slowly does not feel like losing. Doing something and losing quickly does. Evolutionary psychologists have offered a plausible reason this asymmetry might exist at all. For a creature living close to survival's edge, the downside of a bad gamble, starvation, injury, exile was almost always more costly than the upside of a good one was beneficial. A nervous system tuned to fear loss more than it craves gain would on average have lived longer. That nervous system is still the one making decisions today, in a world where most losses are no longer fatal, and most of the caution built to survive them no longer needs to be quite so loud. Two people watch the same political debate. One comes away certain their candidate won decisively. The other comes away equally certain of the opposite. Both watched the same words, in the same order, delivered by the same two people. What differed was not the evidence, but which parts of it each viewer's mind chose to notice, remember, and later recall with confidence. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in ways that support what a person already believes, while overlooking or dismissing information that would challenge it. It operates well below the level of deliberate reasoning. A person does not consciously decide to ignore inconvenient evidence, the mind simply fails to register it as strongly, or files it away as an exception rather than a pattern, while evidence that fits the existing belief lands with an easy, confirming click. Research on this bias goes back decades, including classic experiments in which people asked to test a simple rule kept searching for cases that would confirm their initial guess rather than cases that might disprove it, even when disproving evidence would have taught them more. The pattern holds just as strongly in daily life. A person suspicious of a coworker will notice every ambiguous glance as proof, while dismissing every friendly gesture as an exception. A person confident their diet works will notice every good day and forget every bad one. What makes this bias especially stubborn is that it feels, from the inside, exactly like open-minded reasoning. A person gathering confirming evidence experiences the process as simply following the facts, because the facts that would have complicated the picture were quietly filtered out before they ever reached conscious attention. Arguing with someone caught in this pattern rarely helps, since counter-evidence tends to be absorbed into the same filter and treated as further proof of how wrong the other side is. The two debate viewers will go home just as certain as they arrived, each one having watched, in effect, a slightly different debate. In an experiment that has become a staple of psychology courses, researchers asked people to estimate the population of a small country after first watching a wheel spin to a completely random number between 1 and 100. The wheel had nothing whatsoever to do with population figures, and yet those who saw the wheel land on a high number consistently guessed higher populations than those who saw it land low, as though the meaningless number had somehow leaked into their reasoning. This is the anchoring effect, and it is one of the most reliable findings in all of behavioral science. The first number introduced into any estimation, negotiation, or judgment becomes a reference point that subsequent thinking drifts around, even when everyone involved knows the number was arbitrary. Real estate agents understand this instinctively, which is why an inflated opening price on a house tends to raise the final sale price even among buyers who consider themselves shrewd negotiators. The opening figure was never a fact about the house. It became one anyway in the minds doing the calculating. Doctors are not immune. Studies have shown that a diagnosis suggested early in a patient consultation, even offhandedly, can anchor a physician's subsequent judgment more than later, more relevant symptoms would justify. Salary negotiations run on the same mechanism, which is why career advisors so often counsel naming a number first rather than waiting to respond to one, since whoever speaks first tends to set the gravitational center the rest of the conversation orbits. What makes anchoring so difficult to defend against is that awareness of the effect does not reliably prevent it. People warned in advance that an anchor is coming, and told explicitly to ignore it, still drift toward it, only slightly less than people given no warning at all. The bias appears to operate on a level that conscious correction only partially reaches. The wheel in that original experiment was spun again and again, landing on different numbers for different groups, and each time the population of the same unchanged country came out different, depending on nothing but the spin. A performance review contains 9 sentences of specific genuine praise and 1 sentence of mild criticism. Ask the person who received it what they remember an hour later, and the criticism will almost certainly surface first, larger and sharper than any of the praise around it. This is not a personal failing or a sign of low self-esteem. It is a documented, near-universal pattern known as negativity bias, and it appears to be built into the basic architecture of attention itself. Researchers who study this bias have found it at every level of psychological processing, from the speed at which the brain detects an angry face in a crowd of neutral ones, faster than it detects a happy one, to the disproportionate weight a single betrayal carries against years of loyalty in a friendship. One influential review of the research, sometimes summarized as the principle that bad is stronger than good, found the asymmetry holding across memory, emotion, and even physiological response. A brief unpleasant experience produces a larger and more lasting bodily reaction than an equally brief pleasant one. The likely explanation traces back to the uneven stakes of survival. An ancestor who failed to notice a general improvement in the weather lost very little. An ancestor who failed to notice a predator in the grass lost everything. Across evolutionary time, a mind tuned to weight danger more heavily than reward would, on balance, live to reproduce more often than one that weighted the two equally. That tuning did not disappear once the predators did. It simply found new, far smaller dangers to apply itself to: a critical email, an awkward silence, one unkind comment buried inside a mostly kind conversation. The practical cost of this old setting is that modern relationships and workplaces run on a badly skewed exchange rate. It appears to take somewhere between 3 and 5 positive interactions to offset the felt weight of one negative one, a ratio some relationship researchers have measured directly in long-term marriages that stayed happy against ones that did not. The 9 sentences of praise are still true. They simply never had a fair fight. Ask someone 6 months into a new job with a substantial raise how it feels now, and the answer is rarely as electric as it was on the day the offer arrived. The extra income has become simply what they earn. Somewhere in those 6 months, a new baseline quietly formed, and the raise that once felt like a triumph now registers as neutral, the new normal against which the next disappointment or delight will be measured. Psychologists call this hedonic adaptation, sometimes described more informally as the hedonic treadmill, a phrase that captures the mechanism well. Like walking on a treadmill, effort is expended and ground is covered, but the person's actual position, their baseline sense of satisfaction, stays roughly fixed. A landmark study followed lottery winners and people who had recently become paraplegic after accidents, and found that within a surprisingly short window, both groups reported overall life satisfaction levels closer to their own pre-event baselines than to what either extreme circumstance would predict. The lottery winners were not as ecstatic as expected. The accident survivors were not nearly as devastated, longer term, as expected either. The mechanism appears adaptive in origin. A nervous system that stayed permanently overjoyed after every good event, or permanently despairing after every setback, would struggle to notice and respond to new information, new opportunities, new threats. Returning to a stable baseline after any swing allows the mind to keep evaluating the present rather than being anchored permanently to the past. The practical sting of this mechanism is that it applies just as thoroughly to the things people spend their whole lives chasing. A bigger house, a better title, a faster car, all deliver a genuine spike of pleasure that adaptation then quietly, patiently erases, often within weeks. This does not mean such things are worthless, only that they cannot deliver what is sometimes expected of them, a permanently higher floor of contentment. Somewhere out there, the person with the new raise has already stopped noticing it and is looking, without quite realizing it, toward whatever comes next. In a well-known grocery store experiment, researchers set up 2 different tasting tables on different days. One offered shoppers a choice of 6 flavors of jam. The other offered 24. The larger table drew more browsers, more curiosity, more people stopping to look, but when it came to actually buying, the smaller table with fewer choices sold roughly 10 times as much jam. This is the paradox of choice, sometimes called choice overload, and it runs directly against the common assumption that more options make people happier. Beyond a certain point, additional options do not add freedom. They add a mounting cognitive cost, the effort of comparing, weighing, and imagining regret over whichever option gets left behind. Faced with that cost, many people simply choose nothing at all, walking away from a decision entirely rather than working through it. Psychologist Barry Schwartz, who studied this pattern extensively, argued that it produces 2 related casualties. First, a kind of decision paralysis, in which the sheer number of retirement funds, streaming shows, or romantic prospects becomes so large that choosing feels riskier than not choosing. Second, even after a choice is finally made, satisfaction with it tends to drop as the number of forgone alternatives grows, since each option not chosen becomes one more possible source of regret, weighing on the one that was. The effect is not universal. Some later research found it depends heavily on how the options are presented and how confident the chooser already is in their own preferences. But the core pattern has held up across supermarkets, retirement plans, and online dating platforms alike, all of which have at various points discovered that trimming the number of options shown can increase, not decrease, how satisfied people are with what they ultimately pick. The 24 jars are still, somewhere, sitting largely untouched, admired more than chosen. In a laboratory study from the late 1960s, dogs were divided into 2 groups and exposed to a mild but uncomfortable shock. One group could stop the shock by pressing a panel with their nose. The other group, exposed to shocks of identical timing and intensity, had no way to stop them at all, no matter what they tried. Later, both groups were placed in a new setup where escape was easy for everyone, a low barrier that any dog could simply step over to avoid further shocks entirely. The dogs who had previously been able to control their earlier shocks learned the new escape route almost immediately. Many of the dogs who had previously been unable to control anything did not even try. Martin Seligman, who ran this research, called the pattern learned helplessness, and it went on to become one of the most influential findings in all of psychology, eventually reshaping how researchers understood human depression as well. The core finding was unsettling in its simplicity. Repeated exposure to an uncontrollable negative situation teaches an organism not merely that this particular situation cannot be escaped, but that effort itself is pointless, a lesson that then gets carried forward into entirely new situations where effort would in fact work perfectly well. The human parallels are not hard to find. Employees who have repeatedly seen their ideas dismissed, regardless of merit, eventually stop offering ideas at all, even under a new manager who would have welcomed them. People in long-term abusive relationships often stop attempting to leave, not because leaving has become impossible, but because a long history of earlier attempts failing has taught something deeper and harder to unlearn, that trying does not change the outcome. The hopeful twist in Seligman's later career was his discovery that helplessness, once learned, can also be unlearned through direct experiences of actual control and through a deliberate retraining of how a person explains setbacks to themselves. He spent much of the rest of his career studying that reverse process, calling it fittingly learned optimism. The dogs who never learned to escape were not broken. They had simply been taught thoroughly and by direct experience a lesson that was no longer true. A company changes its retirement plan enrollment so that new employees are automatically signed up unless they actively opt out, rather than the reverse. Nothing about the actual retirement plan changes. The contribution rates, the investment options, the employer match all stay identical, and yet enrollment rates jump dramatically, sometimes from under half of eligible employees to well above 90%, purely because the default was flipped. This is status quo bias in its cleanest form, the strong human preference for whatever arrangement is already in place, independent of its actual merits. Changing anything requires a deliberate decision. A small burst of effort and a small risk of regret, while doing nothing requires neither. Faced with that asymmetry, a remarkable number of people will simply let the default stand, even when a brief moment's thought would reveal a better option sitting one small decision away. The bias shows up far beyond retirement forms. Studies of organ donation programs across different countries found dramatically higher donor participation in nations where citizens are automatically enrolled and must opt out, compared to otherwise similar nations where citizens must actively opt in, a gap of tens of percentage points explained by nothing but which box came pre-checked. People stay in phone plans, insurance policies, and subscription services long after better alternatives exist, simply because switching requires an active choice that staying does not. Part of what sustains the bias is a subtle blending with loss aversion, since abandoning a current arrangement, even a mediocre one, can feel like giving something up, while the improved alternative, being merely hypothetical until chosen, does not yet feel like a gain worth pursuing that hard. The current chair, however uncomfortable, is at least a chair. The forms that flipped their defaults did not change what was being offered. They only changed which choice required no choosing at all. A widely reported case from 1964 described a young woman attacked outside her New York apartment building, while, according to the initial reporting, dozens of neighbors reportedly heard or saw some part of the attack and did nothing to intervene or call for help. The exact details of that specific case were later shown by historians to have been overstated in the original reporting, but the puzzle it raised, why a crowd of witnesses might produce less helping behavior rather than more, turned out to be entirely real, and psychologists went on to confirm it repeatedly in careful, controlled experiments. The bystander effect describes a consistent, replicated finding that an individual in need of help is statistically less likely to receive it the more other bystanders are present, not more. Two mechanisms appear to drive the pattern. The first is a diffusion of responsibility, in which each witness reasons, often without fully realizing it, that surely someone else in this larger group will step in, so the personal obligation to act feels lighter than it would if they were alone. The second is a kind of social proof running in the wrong direction. in which each hesitant bystander looks to the others for a cue about whether the situation is actually an emergency, and seeing everyone else also hesitating, concludes mistakenly that it must not be serious after all. Experiments simulating emergencies, from smoke seeping under a door to an actor apparently collapsing, found the pattern reliably. Solitary bystanders helped quickly and often. Groups of bystanders, all facing the identical emergency, helped less often and more slowly, each person's inaction quietly reinforcing everyone else's. What makes the effect genuinely useful to know is that it can be broken with a single deliberate act. Once one person in a hesitant crowd steps forward, the diffusion collapses almost instantly, and others typically follow within seconds. Personal safety trainers now teach this directly, advising people caught needing help in a crowd to single out one specific bystander by description or eye contact, breaking the anonymity that let responsibility scatter in the first place. The crowd was never made of unusually cold people. It was made of ordinary people, each one waiting for someone else to go first. In the early 1970s, psychologist Irving Janis examined a series of major foreign policy decisions that had gone badly wrong, despite being made by rooms full of capable, experienced advisors. He noticed a pattern common to the failures, a strong pressure toward consensus that had quietly silenced doubts before they could ever be spoken aloud. He coined a term for it, groupthink, borrowing the structure of the word deliberately from George Orwell's fiction, to signal how close the phenomenon sat to actual thought control, even though no one in the room had intended anything of the sort. Groupthink emerges not from stupidity or malice, but from a group's own cohesion working against it. When a team feels close, loyal, and confident in its shared judgment, dissent starts to feel like disloyalty rather than diligence. Members who privately harbour doubts often assume wrongly that their doubt must be the uninformed one, since everyone else in the room appears so certain. A kind of silent, mutual, and entirely unspoken agreement forms to not be the person who complicates a decision the group has already, apparently, settled on. Janis identified several telltale symptoms that tend to accompany the pattern: an illusion of invulnerability that makes the group feel too capable to fail, a tendency to rationalize away warning signs rather than investigate them, and often the informal emergence of what he called a mind guard, a member who actively steers dissenting information away from the group's attention, usually with the best of intentions, trying to protect a fragile unity. The antidotes that later research settled on are straightforward in principle and hard in practice, since they all require deliberately introducing friction that a cohesive group is instinctively trying to avoid, assigning someone the explicit role of devil's advocate, seeking outside opinions before a decision hardens, withholding a leader's own preference until subordinates have voiced theirs first, since an early stated preference from someone senior tends to end the conversation before it has properly begun. The rooms Janis studied were not full of fools. They were full of people who trusted each other, perhaps a little too completely, at exactly the moment distrust would have served them best. A person who skips voting because they are certain their preferred candidate will win easily, based on the fact that everyone they personally know supports the same candidate, is demonstrating a bias with a specific name. The false consensus effect describes the tendency to overestimate how widely one's own opinions, habits, and preferences are shared by the general population, largely because the sample of people most available to us, our friends, our neighborhood, our social feed, is rarely a random or representative slice of everyone else. The original research on this bias, conducted by psychologist Lee Ross and colleagues in the late 1970s, asked participants to guess how many other people would make the same choice they themselves had just made in a hypothetical scenario. Consistently, people overestimated how many others would agree with their own choice, regardless of what that choice actually was. The effect held even when the participants had no real information about anyone else's likely answer at all. The mechanism appears to run through simple availability. A person's own belief, along with the beliefs of the people they talk to most, sit close at hand in memory, easy to retrieve and easy to mistake for a representative sample of humanity in general. Meanwhile, the beliefs of people outside that circle require actual effort to imagine, and effortful information tends to be underweighted relative to information that arrives easily. The bias helps explain a familiar frustration in political and cultural disagreements, the genuine bewilderment each side often expresses that the other side's position is even held by anyone at all, let alone by nearly half a country. Each side, surrounded largely by people who agree with them, has quietly and honestly overestimated how universal that agreement actually is. The person who skipped the vote, confident of an easy win, may well be surprised by the final count, having mistaken the room they were standing in for the room everyone else was standing in too. A driver cuts sharply into your lane without signalling, and the first thought that arrives is rarely charitable. Reckless, rude, careless with other people's safety. A week later, running late for an appointment, you cut into a lane yourself without quite enough warning, and the explanation that arrives this time is entirely different. You were rushed. The other driver was going too slowly. The circumstances left no better option. Same action, opposite explanation, depending entirely on who committed it. This asymmetry is known as the fundamental attribution error, a term coined by social psychologist Lee Ross, who considered the bias significant enough to earn that unusually strong word in its name, fundamental, because it appeared so pervasively across so many kinds of judgment. When observing someone else's behavior, people tend to attribute it heavily to that person's character or disposition, while systematically underweighting the situational pressures that might have shaped it. When explaining their own identical behavior, the weighting flips almost entirely. Situational pressure moves to the foreground and character recedes. Classic experiments demonstrated the effect even in artificial, low-stakes settings. Participants who watched someone read a persuasive essay aloud. When told in advance that the reader had been assigned that specific position at random and had no personal choice in the matter, still rated the reader as genuinely holding the opinions expressed in the essay, as though the coerced circumstance had barely registered at all. The practical toll of this bias falls heaviest on judgments of other people made from a distance, without the texture of context that we always grant ourselves automatically. A late employee looks lazy to a manager who has never seen their commute. A struggling student looks unmotivated to a teacher who has never seen their home. The gap closes, research suggests, primarily through actual proximity and actual information, since attribution errors soften considerably once an observer is given some glimpse of the same situational pressures the person judged already knew about themselves. The driver who cut you off is, statistically, running late for a reason every bit as real as yours was. In one well-known study, college students were asked to wear a deliberately embarrassing t-shirt printed with an outdated and mildly ridiculous image, and then walk into a room full of their peers. Afterward, the students who had worn the shirt were asked to estimate what percentage of the room had noticed it. Their estimates ran roughly twice as high as the number of peers who, when actually asked afterward, could correctly recall anything about the shirt at all. This gap is known as the spotlight effect, the persistent overestimation of how much other people are actually noticing our appearance, our mistakes, and our small nervous behaviors. The name captures the felt experience precisely. A person who stumbles over a word in a presentation feels as though a spotlight has swung onto them, illuminating the error for everyone in the room, when, in reality, most of the audience was thinking about something else entirely, quite possibly their own upcoming turn to speak, and processed the stumble as barely worth noting. The mechanism behind the bias traces back to a simple asymmetry in perspective. Each person has continuous, vivid, first-hand access to their own thoughts, feelings, and self-consciousness, an intensity of self-awareness that has no equivalent when observing anyone else. Because that intensity is so available internally, it gets mistakenly projected outward, as though other people must be experiencing a similar intensity of attention toward us that they are, in fact, reserving almost entirely for themselves. The practical relief offered by this research is genuine and fairly durable, once it is properly absorbed. Public speakers coached on the spotlight effect specifically often report a real drop in performance anxiety, not because the audience's attention changes, but because the speaker's estimate of that attention becomes more accurate. The coffee stain, the mispronounced word, the shirt tag left, flipped outward, these loom enormous from the inside and register as barely a flicker from the outside. The students in the embarrassing shirt walked out of that room far more self-conscious than anyone around them had any reason to make them feel. A hiring manager meets two candidates with nearly identical resumes. One has a warmer smile, a more confident handshake, and a slightly more polished way of speaking. Within minutes, that candidate is quietly rated as more competent, more trustworthy, and more likely to succeed in the role, judgments that have, on paper, no logical connection at all to warmth or confidence of delivery. This is the halo effect in its simplest, most everyday form. The halo effect describes how one favorable trait, often something as superficial as physical attractiveness or a pleasant voice, creates a generalized positive impression that then bleeds unearned credibility onto everything else about a person, their intelligence, their honesty, their skill. Early research on the effect, dating back to psychologist Edward Thorndike's work in the 1920s studying military officers, found that raters who liked a soldier's physical bearing consistently rated that same soldier higher on entirely unrelated qualities like leadership and intelligence, traits the rater had no direct evidence about at all. The effect works in reverse just as reliably, sometimes called the horn effect, in which one unfavorable trait drags down judgment of everything else about a person, however unrelated. A single unkempt appearance, an awkward laugh, or a nervous tick can quietly poison an entire impression, well beyond whatever actual bearing that trait has on competence. The halo effect shapes outcomes far beyond first impressions in job interviews. It influences how juries perceive defendants, with more conventionally attractive defendants in some studies receiving measurably lighter sentences for comparable crimes. It shapes teacher evaluations of student work, and it shapes how audiences judge the arguments of a charismatic public speaker, sometimes independent of whether the argument itself actually holds together under scrutiny. What makes the halo effect hard to correct for is that it does not feel, from the inside, like a shortcut being taken. It feels like a holistic, intuitive read on a whole person, arrived at instantly and confidently, long before any actual evidence about most of that person's real qualities has been gathered. The warmer smile, in the end, told the hiring manager nothing reliable about whether the candidate could do the job. A classroom of students each receive what they are told is a personalized psychological profile, generated for them individually based on a personality test they filled out earlier. Asked to rate how accurately the profile described them, most students give it a high mark, often remarking on how specifically it seemed to capture something true and personal about them. Every student in the room received the exact same profile, word for word. This demonstration, first run by psychologist Bertram Forer in the 1940s, gave the effect its common name, the Barnum effect, after the showman P.T. Barnum, who was famously credited with the observation that a sucker is born every minute, though the phrase's actual origins are murkier than the attribution suggests. Forer's original profile, still used in classrooms today, was built entirely from statements vague and flattering enough to apply to nearly anyone, phrases about needing others to like and admire them, while also having a tendency towards self-criticism, about having untapped potential not yet fully used. The effect explains a great deal of the enduring appeal of horoscopes, personality quizzes, and cold reading performances, all of which rely on the same underlying trick, statements broad enough that almost any reader can find a personal detail to hang them on, combined with a natural human tendency to notice and remember the hits while quietly discarding the misses. The specific detail supplied by the reader's own imagination, filling gaps the vague statement left open, gets misattributed to the accuracy of the statement itself. What makes the Barnum effect persist even among people who intellectually understand it is that the feeling of being seen is genuinely pleasant, and pleasant feelings are hard to argue oneself out of, even once the mechanism producing them has been explained in full. Every student in that classroom walked out feeling personally understood by a document that understood nothing about any one of them in particular. Psychologist Ellen Langer ran a study in the 1970s in which office workers were sold raffle tickets for a lottery. Half were simply handed a ticket with a number already printed on it. The other half were given a blank card and allowed to choose their own number themselves. Before the drawing, Langer's researchers approached each participant and offered to buy the ticket back. Those who had chosen their own number demanded, on average, roughly 4 times more money to sell it back than those who had simply been handed one, despite the two groups holding mathematically identical odds of winning. Langer called the underlying pattern the illusion of control, the tendency to overestimate one's actual influence over outcomes that are, in truth, left to substantially or entirely to chance. The mere presence of an action, choosing a number, rolling dice with more force, pressing an elevator button repeatedly, creates a felt sense of agency that has no actual bearing on the outcome those actions are meant to influence. The illusion shows up reliably in gambling behavior, where players at a craps table throw the dice with visibly more force when betting on high numbers and more gently when betting on low ones, as though physical effort could bend probability itself. It shows up in the well-documented but functionally pointless crosswalk buttons in many cities, disconnected from the traffic's signal system decades ago, but left in place because pressing them gives pedestrians a comforting sense of having done something. The illusion appears to strengthen under conditions that closely resemble genuine skill, familiarity with the task, personal choice within it, competition against a visibly less confident opponent, all of which nudge a chance-based activity to feel, subjectively, more like a skill-based one, even when the actual mechanics underneath remain entirely random. The office workers who chose their own numbers never actually improved their odds of winning that lottery. They only improved considerably their own belief that they had. A song that sounded unremarkable, even mildly irritating, on its first radio play can, by the 10th or 12th hearing, become a genuine favourite, with no new information about the song itself having been introduced along the way. The melody did not improve. The lyrics did not deepen. What changed was simply the number of times it had been heard. Psychologist Robert Zayonk demonstrated this pattern rigorously in the late 1960s, showing people meaningless shapes, unfamiliar words, and unfamiliar faces at varying frequencies, then asking them to rate how much they liked each one. Across dozens of experiments, the pattern held with remarkable consistency. Greater exposure produced greater liking, even for stimuli that carried no positive meaning whatsoever, and that participants could not consciously recall having seen before. Zayonk called the finding the mere exposure effect, a name chosen precisely because mere repetition, stripped of any other positive association, was doing the entire job. The effect helps explain a great deal about how affection quietly forms in ordinary life, well beyond music. A neighbour's face, seen often enough in passing without a single actual conversation, comes to feel trustworthy and familiar in a way that has nothing to do with any evidence of trustworthiness at all. A brand name, seen repeatedly on billboards and packaging, acquires a comfortable, positive glow that advertisers understand and exploit deliberately, since repetition alone, entirely apart from any argument about the product's quality, reliably nudges consumer preference. Researchers have found the effect works most powerfully when exposure happens below the threshold of conscious attention, brief enough that a person cannot consciously recall having seen the stimulus at all, suggesting the mechanism operates largely outside deliberate awareness, a quiet accumulation of familiarity the conscious mind is never quite invited to inspect. The song is, by most objective measures, exactly the same song it was on that first irritating play. Only the listener has changed, and only because the listener kept listening. In an experiment run by economist Richard Thaler and colleagues, half a group of participants were given an ordinary coffee mug and then asked the lowest price they would accept to sell it. The other half, who had never been given a mug at all, were asked the highest price they would be willing to pay to buy the exact same one. Ordinary economic theory predicts these two prices should land close together, since the mug's value should not depend on which side of the transaction a person happens to be standing on. In practice, the sellers who already owned the mug demanded, on average, roughly twice as much as the buyers were willing to offer. This gap is known as the endowment effect, the finding that simply possessing an object inflates the value a person assigns to it purely because it now belongs to them. Letting go of something already owned registers, psychologically, as a loss, and losses, per the earlier finding about loss aversion, carry roughly twice the emotional weight of an equivalent gain. The mug did not change in the moments it passed from the researcher's hand into the participants. Its felt value did. The endowment effect shapes far more consequential decisions than coffee mug experiments. Homeowners regularly overvalue their own homes relative to what an objective appraisal or the actual market suggests, purely because it is theirs. Negotiators find that once a person has physically or mentally taken possession of an item, even briefly, they become measurably harder to negotiate it away from than they were before that possession began. Return policies at retailers exploit this same mechanism deliberately, since a customer who takes an item home, even for a trial period, often finds parting with it afterward harder than not buying it would have been in the first place. What the effect reveals, at bottom, is that value is not a fixed property residing inside an object, waiting to be discovered. It is something the mind assigns and reassigns constantly. Shifting the instant ownership itself changes hands. The participants who received the mug walked away from that laboratory believing, quite sincerely, that it was worth considerably more than it had been worth to anyone in the room 5 minutes earlier. A group of college students working on senior theses were once asked, early in the academic year, to predict how many days they would need to finish the project if everything went well, and separately how many days they would need if everything that could reasonably go wrong actually did. Later, the researchers tracked how long the theses actually took to complete. The actual completion times landed closest not to the students' realistic worst-case estimates, but well beyond even those, past the outer edge of what anyone in the room had considered plausible. This pattern, first named and studied extensively by Daniel Kahneman and colleague Amos Tversky, is called the planning fallacy, the systematic tendency to underestimate how long a task will take, how much it will cost, and how many things will go wrong along the way, even when the person making the estimate has direct personal experience of similar tasks running over before. What makes the fallacy so resistant to correction by experience is a specific quirk in how the mind builds a forecast in the first place. When imagining a future task, attention gravitates naturally toward the plan itself, the clean, linear sequence of steps that leads smoothly to completion, while largely failing to imagine the specific unplanned obstacles, the sick days, the unexpected complications, the underestimated difficulty of individual steps that history shows will almost certainly arise, but that no specific version of can be predicted in advance. Organizations fall into the same trap at enormous scale. Major construction and infrastructure projects around the world have a long, well-documented history of running over both budget and schedule, sometimes by multiples rather than fractions, a pattern consistent enough that some economists have proposed deliberately adding a substantial buffer to every large project estimate, simply because the planning fallacy is now considered close to a statistical certainty rather than a risk. The students, most of them, finished their theses eventually, considerably later than even their own gloomiest prediction had suggested, and likely began their next large project with exactly the same misplaced optimism as before. A person with a worrying symptom that has persisted for weeks keeps finding reasons to delay the doctor's appointment. A freelancer behind on invoices avoids opening the banking app for days at a stretch. A person midway through a difficult breakup leaves messages from a lawyer unread on a phone screen for as long as physically possible. In each case, the information waiting to be received might genuinely help, might even be urgent, and in each case the person chooses, quietly and repeatedly, not to look. This pattern is known as the ostrich effect, named for the folk image, itself not entirely accurate as a description of actual ostrich behavior, of a bird burying its head in the sand rather than face an approaching threat. Researchers studying financial behavior first documented the effect systematically by noticing that investors check their portfolio balances measurably less often during market downturns than during market upswings, actively avoiding exactly the information that a falling market makes most urgently relevant to any real decision they might need to make. The logic behind the avoidance, while ultimately self-defeating, is not irrational in the moment it occurs. Checking bad news produces an immediate, certain jolt of anxiety, while not checking preserves, at least temporarily, the comfortable uncertainty of not yet knowing. The mind readily trades a larger, later cost for a smaller, immediate relief, the same underlying present bias that shows up across many of these traps in different clothing. The cost of the avoidance, though, compounds precisely because the underlying problem does not pause, simply because it is not being observed. The bank balance keeps falling, the symptom keeps developing, the legal deadline keeps approaching. Financial advisors and physicians alike have learned to build systems around this predictable avoidance, automatic alerts, scheduled check-ins, appointment reminders sent by a third party, rather than relying on the very avoidance-prone person to initiate contact on their own. The envelope, unopened, does not stop containing whatever it contains. It only stops the person from knowing it for exactly as long as they can bear not to. Offer a person the choice between $100 today or $110 in exactly 1 month, and a striking number of people will take the 100 today, effectively paying $10 for the privilege of not waiting 30 days. Offer the same people a choice between $100 in exactly 1 year or $110 in exactly 1 year and 1 month, and the preference reverses sharply, with most now willing to wait the extra month for the extra $10. The two choices are, mathematically, describing the identical trade-off, $10 extra for 1 extra month of waiting. What changes is only how far away both options sit from the present moment. This pattern is called present bias, a specific and unusually well-studied form of what economists call temporal discounting, the general tendency to value a reward less the further away in time it sits. Present bias describes the specific, disproportionate premium placed on immediacy itself, a premium that shrinks rapidly once both options are pushed even slightly further into the future. The behavioral economists Richard Thaler and George Lowenstein, among others, help formalize this pattern into models that better explain real financial behavior than the older assumption that people discount the future at a smooth, constant rate. Present bias explains why retirement saving is such a persistent challenge, even among people who fully understand intellectually the importance of compound growth over decades, since the discomfort of contributing less spendable income today sits close and vivid, while the benefit of a comfortable retirement sits decades away and comparatively abstract. The same bias shows up in far smaller daily decisions: the extra hour of sleep chosen over the morning workout, the dessert chosen over the diet, the finished project deadline pushed one more day into a future that, once it arrives, will present the identical temptation all over again. Behavioral economists have proposed several structural fixes rather than relying on willpower alone: automatic enrollment in savings plans, commitment devices that lock funds away from easy access, and defaults that require an active choice to opt out of the more patient option rather than the reverse. The extra $10 was always worth waiting for. It only stopped feeling that way the moment the waiting had to start today. In a study conducted by psychologist Robert Rosenthal in the mid-1960s, elementary school teachers were told that a small group of their students, selected at random from ordinary class rosters, had scored exceptionally high on a test measuring intellectual potential and were expected to bloom academically over the coming year. There was no actual test. The students had been chosen entirely by chance, with no relation whatsoever to their real ability. By the end of the year, the randomly labelled students showed measurably greater gains in academic performance than their classmates, gains real enough to register on standardized assessments. Rosenthal called this the Pygmalion effect, borrowing the name from the ancient myth of a sculptor whose belief in his own creation brought it to life. His explanation for the mechanism was not mystical. Teachers who believed certain students were destined to excel appear to have unconsciously altered how they treated those students, offering them more encouragement, more patient attention when they struggled, more challenging material, and subtly warmer nonverbal signals, none of which the teachers were aware of doing differently. The students, in turn, responded to that quietly improved environment by actually performing better, closing what had begun as a purely fictional gap into a genuine one. The finding sits alongside its mirror image, sometimes called the Gollum effect, in which a teacher's low expectation of a student produces the same subtle mechanism running in reverse: less encouragement, less patience, a colder classroom climate, ultimately yielding a genuine decline in performance that then appears misleadingly to confirm the low expectation that produced it in the first place. The effect has since been documented well beyond classrooms, in workplace management, where a supervisor's private belief about an employee's potential shapes coaching and opportunity in ways the employee eventually grows into or shrinks to fit, and in clinical settings, where a therapist's belief about a patient's likely progress has been shown, in some studies, to correlate with the patient's actual outcome. No test had ever actually measured those students' potential, but a belief, quietly and invisibly acted upon for a full school year, built something real out of nothing at all. A person delivering a wedding toast, hands trembling slightly and voice catching once on an unfamiliar word, spends the rest of the evening convinced the entire room noticed exactly how nervous they were. Ask around afterward, and most guests remember only a warm, slightly informal speech, with no particular recollection of trembling hands or a caught voice at all. The speaker's private, vivid experience of nervousness never made it across the room in anything like the intensity it was felt. This gap between what a person feels internally and what they assume is visible externally is called the illusion of transparency, and it has been demonstrated in laboratory settings using tasks as simple as asking participants to drink a foul-tasting liquid while keeping their facial expression neutral, then estimating how many observers correctly guessed the drink was unpleasant. Participants consistently overestimated how many observers had correctly read their disguised expression, believing their internal reaction had leaked through far more visibly than it actually had. The illusion runs in both emotional directions. A person concealing excitement about a surprise assumes, often wrongly, that their poker face has failed and the surprise is already given away. A person harboring a private grudge in a conversation assumes their tone has revealed the grudge when the other party may have noticed nothing unusual at all. The bias appears rooted in the same asymmetry that produces the spotlight effect. An internal emotional experience is so vivid and continuous to the person feeling it that they struggle to fully discount how much of that vividness is actually escaping outward to an observer whose access to it is, in reality, quite limited. The illusion carries real social cost. Negotiators who believe their bluff has surely been detected sometimes fold prematurely, giving away an advantage that a calmer read of the situation would have preserved. Couples in conflict often assume, incorrectly, that their frustration or hurt is obviously legible to their partner, and grow further hurt when the partner fails to respond to feelings that, in fact, were never as visible as they felt from the inside. The toast, trembling hands and all, was, to nearly everyone listening, simply a nice toast. A software engineer with 15 years of experience sits down to write a simple guide explaining a basic function of the program she built, and finds, to her own frustration, that she keeps skipping steps a true beginner would need explained, because those steps have become so automatic to her that she genuinely struggles to remember they were ever difficult at all. Her fluency, the very thing that makes her good at the software, is quietly sabotaging her ability to teach it. This pattern is known as the curse of knowledge, first demonstrated formally in a study where participants were assigned to tap out the rhythm of a well-known song using only their knuckles on a table, while a listener tried to guess the song from the tapping alone. The tappers, who could hear the full melody clearly and vividly inside their own heads as they tapped, predicted that listeners would guess correctly around half the time. The actual success rate among listeners, who received nothing but a series of disconnected taps, was closer to 1 in 40. The tappers simply could not imagine what the tapping sounded like without the melody they themselves could not stop hearing. The curse explains a great deal of the friction between experts and the audiences they are trying to reach. Doctors overestimate how much medical background their patients already possess. Professors overestimate how obvious a foundational concept is to a student encountering it for the first time. Experienced employees asked to write instructions for a new hire routinely omit steps so basic to them that they have stopped registering as steps at all, producing manuals that make perfect sense to whoever already understands the process, and very little sense to anyone who does not. The most effective known corrective is not more expertise but deliberate contact with genuine beginners, watching someone actually attempt the task cold, since that direct observation supplies exactly this missing information that imagination alone cannot reliably reconstruct once true fluency has taken over. The engineer eventually rewrote her guide after watching an actual new employee struggle through it, adding back in a dozen steps at all. Quite honestly, forgotten were steps at all. A person shown a clear, well-sourced correction to a false claim they had shared online sometimes does not update their belief in response. In a documented number of cases, they emerge from the correction holding the original false belief even more firmly than before they encountered any counter-evidence at all. This counterintuitive pattern has been observed and studied under the name the backfire effect. Research into the effect, including studies by political scientists Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler, found that corrections aimed at politically or personally significant misconceptions sometimes strengthened rather than weakened the misperception among the specific group of people most invested in believing it, even while the same correction worked as intended among people with less personal investment in the claim being true. Later, broader replication attempts across many topics found the backfire effect to be less universal than the earliest studies suggested, occurring reliably only under certain conditions rather than as a general rule for every correction on every subject. The conditions that appear to matter most involve identity. A correction that merely updates a neutral factual detail tends to be accepted without much resistance. A correction that threatens a belief bound up tightly with a person's sense of group identity, political affiliation, or self-image is processed less like new information and more like a personal or social attack, triggering a defensive response that can, in some documented instances, entrench the original belief further as a form of psychological self-protection. What researchers now generally agree on is that the manner of correction matters considerably. Corrections that avoid directly repeating the false claim before debunking it, that affirm the person's underlying values or identity rather than attacking them, and that offer a coherent alternative explanation to fill the gap left by the debunked claim tend to succeed far more often than blunt, repeated contradiction. Facts alone, it turns out, were never quite doing the job people once assumed they were doing on their own. After a widely covered plane crash, ticket sales for air travel measurably dip for weeks, even though flying remains, by every available statistic, dramatically safer than driving the same distance by car. The actual numbers have not changed. What changed is a vivid, emotionally charged image now sitting close at hand in memory, and that image is doing far more work in the traveller's decision than any statistic ever could. This substitution of feeling for calculation is called the affect heuristic, a term developed by psychologist Paul Slovic and colleagues to describe how a quick emotional reaction, whether fear, comfort, disgust or excitement, often stands in entirely for a slower, more deliberate weighing of actual risk and benefit. The heuristic operates efficiently much of the time, since gut reactions are fast and often serviceable as rough guides, but it becomes unreliable precisely in situations where the emotional intensity of an event has little to do with its actual statistical frequency, exactly the gap that produces irrational fear of flying alongside comparatively little fear of the daily commute that carries in reality a far higher cumulative risk. Slovic's research found the heuristic shaping judgment across an unusually wide range of decisions, from public perception of nuclear power, which registers as far more frightening than its actual historical safety record would justify, to public perception of chemical additives with unfamiliar, hard-to-pronounce names, which register as more dangerous than familiar substances carrying comparable or greater actual risk, purely because unfamiliarity itself produces a mildly unsettling feeling that gets misread as a signal of genuine danger. What makes the affect heuristic difficult to correct for through education alone is that the emotional reaction typically arrives before any statistic can be consulted, and by the time the statistic is available, the emotional verdict has often already shaped how that statistic gets received, accepted eagerly if it confirms the feeling, and picked apart skeptically if it contradicts it. The traveller who chooses to drive instead of fly, weeks after the crash, has made a decision that, statistically, made their trip considerably more dangerous, not less, while feeling, the entire time, considerably safer for having made it. A child who draws constantly and joyfully, for no reason beyond the pure pleasure of drawing, is enrolled in a program that pays a small reward for every completed drawing. For a while, the reward simply adds to the pleasure, but researchers who studied this exact scenario found something unsettling once the rewards stopped, weeks or months later. Children who had been paid to draw showed measurably less interest in drawing during their free time afterward than children who had drawn the entire time purely for its own sake, with no reward ever introduced. This pattern is known as the over-justification effect, first demonstrated formally by psychologist Mark Lepper, David Green, and Richard Nisbett in the early 1970s. Their explanation drew on a broader theory of motivation, distinguishing between intrinsic motivation, doing something because the activity itself is satisfying, and extrinsic motivation, doing something for an external reward attached to it. When an external reward is introduced for an activity that was already intrinsically enjoyable, the mind appears to quietly reinterpret its own reason for doing the activity, concluding, in effect, that it must be doing this for the reward rather than for its own sake, since a reward is now present and rewards typically signal exactly that kind of external motivation. Once the reward is later removed, the intrinsic enjoyment that originally drove the behavior does not simply snap back into place. It has, to some degree, been crowded out and replaced by a motivational structure the removed reward can no longer support, leaving a gap where the original pleasure used to sit. The effect carries real implications well beyond childhood drawing. Employers who introduce financial bonuses for tasks employees previously found meaningful sometimes find, once budgets tighten and the bonuses disappear, that the original meaningful engagement has quietly eroded along with them. Parents who pay children for reading, hoping to encourage a lifelong habit, sometimes find the opposite effect. A child who now reads only when paid to. The reward was never really a gift. It was, without anyone quite intending it, a subtle transaction that replaced something freely given with something that now had to be paid for to continue. Researchers Michael Norton, Daniel Mochan, and Dan Ariely asked participants to assemble a simple piece of flat-pack furniture themselves, then asked them to bid on how much they would pay for it. A separate group was shown an identical, already assembled version of the same piece and asked to bid on that instead. The people who had assembled the furniture with their own hands consistently bid higher for it than the second group bid for the identical finished product, despite both objects being, once completed, indistinguishable. The researchers named this the IKEA effect, after the Swedish furniture retailer whose entire business model runs on customers assembling their own purchases at home. Their explanation centered on effort. Labor invested into creating something appears to become psychologically fused with the finished object itself, so that valuing the object comes to include, quietly and often unconsciously, valuing the work that produced it. A shelf assembled with one's own hands is, in a real sense, no longer just a shelf. It carries a small residue of the person's own effort embedded in it. The effect helps explain a pattern familiar to anyone who has ever cooked a labor-intensive meal from scratch and found it tasting somehow better than an equally good meal that arrived already prepared, even when a blind taste test would likely find little actual difference. It helps explain why a garden, tended personally over a full season, carries a satisfaction that an identical garden, hired out entirely to a landscaping crew, rarely produces in quite the same way. Businesses have learned to build the effect deliberately into their products, adding small customizable steps to an otherwise finished item specifically so customers feel a sense of authorship over the final result, a sense that reliably increases both satisfaction and willingness to pay, even when the actual functional difference the customization makes is minimal. The furniture, fully assembled, functions exactly the same whether a person built it themselves or bought it ready-made. Only the story attached to it, quietly and afterward, changed. Read someone a list of 20 ordinary grocery items one at a time, and then ask them a few minutes later to recall as many as they can. The pattern that emerges is remarkably consistent across nearly every person tested. The first several items on the list are recalled reliably. The last several items are recalled reliably too. The items sitting in the middle, roughly the 8th through the 14th, vanish far more often, blurred into an undifferentiated middle that the memory simply failed to hold onto with the same grip. This is the serial position effect, and it results from two entirely separate memory advantages operating at opposite ends of the list. The early items benefit from what researchers call the primacy effect, since with fewer competing items to process at that early point, the mind has more spare attention to rehearse and transfer them into longer-term storage. The final items benefit from the recency effect, since they remain, quite simply, still resting in short-term memory at the moment of recall, not yet displaced by anything newer. The middle items receive neither advantage, arriving too late for the easy rehearsal the early items got, and being displaced too soon by the later items to still be sitting fresh in short-term memory at recall time. The effect shapes far more than list memorization experiments. Job interviewers, without realizing it, often remember the first and last candidates of a long interview day more vividly and favorably than the candidates seen in the middle stretch, an artifact of memory rather than an accurate reflection of who actually interviewed best. Audiences at a long meeting or presentation retain the opening framing and the closing summary far better than the substantial content sandwiched between them, a pattern many experienced speakers now deliberately design around, front-loading key points and repeating them again at the close, rather than trusting the middle of a talk to land with equal force. The grocery list, read back a week later, will likely still show the same shape, a clear memory of milk and bread from the start, a clear memory of the very last item mentioned, and a fog in between where a half-dozen equally real items simply never found a place to land. A subscription service offers two plans, a digital-only subscription for $50 and a print plus digital bundle for $100. Most customers, comparing the two, choose the cheaper digital option. Add a third plan to the same page, a print-only subscription also priced at $100, with no digital access included at all, and something unusual happens. Almost nobody chooses that new third option, but the number of customers choosing the bundle, the exact same $100 package that existed before, rises sharply. This is the decoy effect at work, and the print-only option in that classic example, drawn from a real study of magazine subscription pricing, conducted by behavioral economist Dan Ariely, functions entirely as a decoy, never intended to be chosen itself but included specifically to reshape how the other two genuine options get compared. Placed next to a clearly inferior third option priced the same as the bundle suddenly looks like an obvious bargain by comparison, gaining something print-only entirely for free, a framing that never occurred to most customers when the bundle was compared only against the cheaper digital plan on its own. The underlying mechanism relates closely to how people generally struggle to judge absolute value in isolation, relying instead on nearby comparisons to establish what counts as a good deal. A decoy option deliberately positioned as an inferior version of one of the two real choices gives the mind an easy, favourable comparison to latch onto, one that quietly does most of the persuading before any real deliberation about actual needs or budget has even begun. Retailers, restaurant menus, and real estate listings use the decoy effect with some regularity, often by including a clearly overpriced or clearly inferior option specifically to make a nearby target option, the one the seller actually wants chosen, look like the obviously sensible middle ground by contrast. The print-only plan sat there on the page, priced deliberately to be ignored, doing its actual job perfectly by never being chosen at all. In a study conducted by Daniel Kahneman and colleagues, patients undergoing a colonoscopy, a procedure that at the time was often uncomfortable throughout its duration, were divided by how their procedures happened to end. One group's procedure concluded at the point of peak discomfort, stopping abruptly there. A second group's procedure, while equally or even more uncomfortable overall in total accumulated discomfort, included a brief additional period at the very end, during which the discomfort eased before the procedure fully concluded. When asked afterward to rate how unpleasant the overall experience had been, the second group, despite enduring more total discomfort by any minute-by-minute measure, rated the experience as considerably less unpleasant than the first. Kahneman called this the peak-end rule, describing how memory of an extended experience is built disproportionately from two data points, the single most intense moment within it, whether pleasant or painful, and the way the experience concludes, largely disregarding both the total duration of the experience and the sum of all the moments in between. A vacation remembered fondly may have contained several genuinely tedious days, but if it ended on a spectacular final evening, memory quietly discounts the tedium and elevates the ending. A relationship that was mostly warm for years but ended in a bitter final argument often gets remembered, unfairly but reliably, as having been mostly bitter throughout. The finding runs directly against a common intuitive assumption that memory works something like an average, weighing every moment of an experience roughly equally in forming a final verdict. Kahneman's research, distinguishing between what he called the experiencing self, who lives through every moment in real time, and the remembering self, who later constructs a summary judgment from a small, highlighted set of those moments, suggested that most major life decisions, in practice, get made by consulting the remembering self's compressed, distorted highlight reel rather than the experiencing self's full and more accurate record. The practical use of this finding, once understood, is almost mischievous in its simplicity. A difficult experience, a hard conversation, a demanding day at work, a challenging trip, can often be remembered far more kindly than its actual content deserves, simply by deliberately engineering a calm or pleasant final few minutes before it closes. The colonoscopy patients who experienced the gentler ending walked away from the same underlying procedure with a genuinely different memory of it, built almost entirely from how it stopped. A gambler at a horse race, surveyed just before placing a bet, rates their chosen horse's chances as roughly even against the other contenders in the race. Surveyed again just minutes after placing that same bet, with no new information whatsoever having entered the picture, the same gambler now rates their chosen horse's chances noticeably higher than they did moments before, purely because the bet has now been made and cannot be unmade. This shift is known as choice supportive bias, a close relative of cognitive dissonance, and it describes how the mind retroactively inflates the appeal of whatever has just been chosen while quietly deflating the appeal of the alternatives left behind, smoothing over what might otherwise become an uncomfortable feeling of regret about a decision that, before it was locked in, may genuinely have been a toss-up. The bias operates almost like a psychological insurance policy. Purchased the instant a commitment becomes final, protecting the chooser from having to live with ongoing doubt about a decision that, practically speaking, can no longer be revised anyway. The pattern has been documented well beyond racetracks. Studies of people choosing between similarly rated consumer products, appliances, cars, even roommates assigned somewhat at random, found the same reliable pattern, ratings of the chosen option rising and ratings of the rejected option falling in the period immediately following the decision, a divergence that did not exist, or existed far less starkly, in the moments right before the choice was actually made. While the bias offers a genuine comfort, reducing the psychological discomfort of living with irreversible decisions, it carries a real cost to judgment. A person who retroactively convinces themselves a mediocre choice was actually excellent loses some of the clear-eyed feedback that might otherwise have improved their next decision. The bias smooths the emotional experience of choosing at the direct expense of an accurate record of how good that choice actually was. The gambler's horse, still running the exact same race with the exact same odds it had 2 minutes earlier, has not improved even slightly. Only the gambler's private assessment of it has. Told the story of a person who lost their home in a natural disaster, a listener's first instinct is usually sympathy. Told that the same person had, some years earlier, stopped paying for home insurance to save money, that same listener's sympathy often cools noticeably, replaced by a quieter, less examined thought that the loss was, in some sense, deserved or at least less unfair than it had first appeared. The facts of the disaster itself have not changed. What has changed is a detail that lets the listener preserve a comforting belief that misfortune generally has a cause traceable back to the person it happens to. Psychologist Melvin Lerner named this pattern the just world hypothesis, after a series of experiments in the 1960s in which observers watching an innocent person suffer with no ability to intervene or stop it consistently rated that innocent person more negatively afterward than observers who watched the identical suffering but were told it would soon be relieved. Unable to change the outcome and unwilling to accept that a genuinely undeserving person could simply suffer for no reason at all, observers instead adjusted their opinion of the victim downward, finding some flaw, real or invented, that would make the suffering feel a little less arbitrary and unfair. The hypothesis explains an uncomfortable but well-documented pattern in how societies respond to victims of poverty, illness and crime, a persistent undercurrent of quiet blame directed at the person suffering, disproportionate to any actual evidence that they caused their own circumstance. It is not, Lerner argued, primarily a symptom of cruelty. It functions as a psychological defense, protecting a deeply held and generally useful belief that effort and virtue are rewarded and their absence punished, a belief that motivates hard work and ethical behavior in ordinary circumstances, but curdles into something harsher whenever reality presents clear evidence against it. The alternative belief, that the world sometimes distributes suffering with no correspondence at all to merit, is by most accounts considerably harder to live inside comfortably. Blaming the victim, however unfair to that particular victim, purchases a kind of peace of mind for everyone else still trying to believe the world makes a certain sense. The person who lost the insured or uninsured home did nothing, in either version of the story, to summon the disaster that found them. A student who receives a high grade on an exam typically attributes it, when asked, to their own intelligence and hard work. The same student receiving a low grade on a different exam is far more likely to attribute that outcome to an unfair test, a distracted grader, or simple bad luck. Both explanations arrive with equal sincerity and equal confidence, despite pointing in opposite directions depending on nothing but which outcome actually occurred. This pattern is known as self-serving bias, and it has been documented across an unusually wide range of settings, from classrooms to sports teams to corporate boardrooms. Winning athletes and their coaches, interviewed after a victory, tend to credit skill, preparation and effort. Losing athletes and coaches, interviewed after a defeat with a similar level of sincerity, more often point toward bad officiating, injuries, or unlucky bounce, external factors that preserve the athlete's own sense of competence, even in defeat. Researchers generally understand the bias as serving a protective function for self-esteem, allowing a person to maintain a stable, generally positive view of their own abilities across a life inevitably full of both successes and failures, rather than being forced to continuously revise that self-view downward every time an outcome goes badly. In moderation, this protective function appears to be genuinely healthy, associated in some studies with greater resilience and lower rates of depression, since a mind willing to absorb full personal blame for every single setback tends to fare considerably worse psychologically than one with some capacity to spread that blame around when circumstances genuinely warrant it. The trouble arrives when the bias becomes so consistent and so extreme that it blocks any real learning from failure at all. A salesperson who attributes every lost deal to an unreasonable client, never once to their own pitch or preparation, forfeits the corrective feedback that a poor outcome could otherwise have supplied. The bias, useful in small doses for protecting a fragile ego, becomes a genuine obstacle once it hardens into a permanent refusal to ever look inward. The student with the low grade may well be right that the test was unfair, but the same explanation offered every single time starts to look less like an assessment of the test and more like a habit of the mind protecting itself. Asked to estimate which causes more deaths each year, shark attacks or falling coconuts, a surprising number of people will guess shark attacks, sometimes by a wide margin. The real numbers run the other direction, and by a considerable distance. Shark attacks are a heavily reported, visually dramatic event that receives extensive news coverage relative to how rarely they actually occur. Falling coconuts receive essentially no coverage at all, despite causing more deaths worldwide most years, simply because nobody finds a falling coconut newsworthy. This mismatch is explained by the availability heuristic, first described formally by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who found that people consistently estimate the frequency or likelihood of an event based on how easily examples of it come to mind, rather than on any actual statistical record. Events that are vivid, recent, emotionally striking, or heavily covered by media become disproportionately easy to recall, and that ease of recall gets mistaken, at a largely unconscious level, for genuine statistical frequency. The heuristic shapes public perception of risk in ways with real practical consequences. Terrorism, plane crashes, and violent crime, all heavily and vividly covered by news media, are consistently rated by public surveys as more dangerous, relative to their actual statistical frequency, than causes of death that occur far more often but attract far less dramatic coverage: heart disease, diabetes, ordinary traffic accidents. Public policy attention and funding sometimes follow this same distorted perception rather than the underlying statistics, since visible, dramatic dangers generate political pressure that quieter, more common dangers rarely manage to produce. The heuristic operates efficiently in a world where recent, vivid memory genuinely does correlate with real frequency, which was likely closer to true for most of human evolutionary history than it is in a media-saturated modern one, where an event's vividness now depends far more on how dramatically it can be covered than on how often it actually happens. The coconuts keep falling, unremarked upon, while the sharks, statistically speaking rather rare in their actual harm, continue to occupy a corner of the public imagination entirely out of proportion to the numbers. In a study conducted by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, physicians were presented with statistics about 2 treatments for a serious illness and asked which they would recommend. One group of physicians received the outcome data framed in terms of survival, learning that a particular treatment carried a 90% survival rate. A second group received the mathematically identical outcome data framed instead in terms of mortality, learning that the same treatment carried a 10% death rate. Despite both statements describing precisely the same underlying reality, the physicians shown the survival framing recommended that treatment considerably more often than the physicians shown the mortality framing. This is the framing effect, and its influence extends well beyond hypothetical medical scenarios into essentially every domain where a choice can be described in more than one true but differently weighted way. A jar of ground beef labelled 75% lean sells better in consumer taste tests than an identical jar labelled 25% fat, despite the 2 labels describing an exactly equivalent product. A tax described as a penalty for undesirable behaviour tends to generate more public support than the identical tax described as a fee, even when the actual financial mechanics of the 2 are identical. Tversky and Kahneman's broader work on framing formed part of what came to be called prospect theory, which helped demonstrate that human decision-making does not simply evaluate outcomes against a neutral, objective baseline, but instead evaluates outcomes relative to how they are presented, particularly whether that presentation emphasizes a gain to be had or a loss to be avoided, categories that, per the earlier discussion of loss aversion, are weighted quite differently by the mind even when they describe the same underlying number. What makes the framing effect especially consequential is how easily it can be deployed, deliberately or not, by anyone controlling the language around a decision, a doctor, a politician, an advertiser, a negotiator, each capable of nudging a choice in a preferred direction, using nothing more than which true fact gets emphasized and which gets left in the background. The treatment recommended by more physicians in that study was, in every measurable respect, exactly as effective as the one recommended less often. Only the sentence describing it had changed. A talented salesperson, consistently the top performer on their team, is promoted to sales manager as a reward for that success. Within a year, the team's overall performance has declined, and the former star salesperson, now responsible for coaching, scheduling, and administrative reporting rather than selling, appears visibly less capable and less confident in this new role than they were in their old one. The skills that made them excellent at selling, persuasion, resilience under rejection, individual drive, have little overlap with the skills the new managerial role actually requires. This pattern was named and popularized by educator Lawrence Peter in a 1969 book written with humor but based on a genuinely observed organizational tendency, which came to be known as the Peter Principle. Its core claim is straightforward and, once stated, difficult to dismiss entirely. In hierarchical organizations, employees tend to be promoted based on their performance in their current role, which is a reasonable enough basis for promotion right up until it produces a mismatch, since the qualities that predict success in one role frequently have little bearing on the qualities the next role-up actually demands. Carried to its logical extreme, Peter argued, this tendency means employees keep rising through an organization only until they land in a role where their particular strengths no longer apply, and then, having reached the level at which they are no longer especially competent, they generally stop being promoted any further, remaining indefinitely in a position just beyond the edge of their real ability. The humor in Peter's original framing has not stopped later management researchers from taking the underlying observation seriously, and some large-scale studies of actual corporate promotion data have found supporting patterns, workers promoted primarily on the strength of individual sales performance sometimes underperforming as managers relative to peers promoted using broader criteria that better anticipated managerial demands specifically. The practical remedy some organizations have adopted is a deliberate separation between reward and role, offering high individual performers alternative forms of recognition and compensation, sometimes called dual career ladders, that do not require moving that person into a managerial position their strengths were never actually suited for in the first place. The former top salesperson is, by every measure that mattered in their old job, still exactly as talented as they ever were. The ladder simply kept climbing past the point where that talent still applied. Before a closely contested election, a person genuinely uncertain of the outcome tells friends they truly do not know who will win. After the results come in, the same person, asked to recall their earlier prediction, often remembers themselves as having been considerably more confident of the actual winner than they genuinely were beforehand, sometimes insisting they saw it coming the entire time. This retroactive inflation of predictability is known as hindsight bias, sometimes summarized by researchers with the phrase the knew it all along effect. Studies of the bias have found it operating across an unusually wide range of domains, from sporting events to medical diagnoses to stock market movements, in each case with participants systematically overestimating, after an outcome is known, how confidently they, or people generally, could have predicted that same outcome beforehand. The mechanism behind the bias appears to involve a genuine, if inaccurate, updating of memory itself, rather than simple after-the-fact bragging. Once an outcome becomes known, the mind seems to selectively reconstruct the earlier period of uncertainty in light of that now known outcome, quietly emphasizing whatever early signals pointed toward what actually happened, while downplaying or forgetting the signals that pointed the other way, producing a genuinely felt, if factually distorted, sense that the outcome had been foreseeable all along. The practical cost of this bias falls particularly hard on fair evaluation of past decisions. A doctor's diagnostic choice that was entirely reasonable given the information available at the time can look, in hindsight, like an obvious oversight once the actual, different diagnosis is later confirmed, a distortion that has real consequences in medical malpractice litigation, where juries evaluating a doctor's past decision already know an outcome the doctor could not have known at the time the decision was actually made. Financial analysts similarly tend to view market crashes as having been obviously predictable after they occur, a hindsight-fueled confidence that does little to actually improve their ability to predict the next one. The person who genuinely did not know who would win that election has, within days, rewritten their own memory of that uncertainty into something considerably more confident than it ever really was. Surveyed anonymously about their own personal odds of experiencing a divorce, a serious car accident, or a major illness at some point in their life, most people rate their own individual odds as noticeably lower than the odds they would assign, using the exact same criteria, to an average member of their community. The statistics, of course, cannot actually be lower for every single person surveyed than they are for the population those very people belong to. Something in the estimate is systematically off, and it is off in the same reassuring direction for nearly everyone asked. This pattern is called optimism bias, and researchers including Neil Weinstein, who conducted much of the foundational work on the subject in the early 1980s, found it operating consistently across an unusually broad range of risks, health outcomes, financial setbacks, relationship failures, even minor everyday misfortunes like getting a parking ticket. In each case, people privately grant themselves a modest but persistent exemption from the statistical fate they cheerfully apply to everyone else. The bias appears to serve a real psychological function, contributing to the kind of confidence and forward motivation that makes ambitious projects, difficult relationships, and long-term commitments feel worth attempting in the first place. Some research has associated a healthy dose of optimism bias with lower rates of anxiety and depression, and with a general resilience that a more starkly accurate, statistically grounded view of one's own risk profile does not always provide in equal measure. The cost of the bias becomes clear in contexts where accurate risk assessment genuinely matters for practical safety, smokers who acknowledge the statistical dangers of smoking in the abstract, while quietly believing their own personal risk to be lower than average, drivers who acknowledge the general danger of distracted driving while remaining confident of their own particular ability to handle a phone at the wheel safely. In these contexts, the same bias that makes daily life feel bearable also quietly undermines the caution that might otherwise prevent exactly the harm being underestimated. The survey respondent who rated their own odds of divorce as unusually low is, statistically, no different from anyone else in the room, making the same private, comforting exception for themselves. A person scrolling through photographs of an old classmate's recent vacation, new home, and apparently thriving career finds their own mood quietly souring over the course of a few idle minutes, despite nothing in their own actual life having changed at all during that scrolling. What has changed is only the reference point against which that unchanged life is being measured. Psychologist Leon Festinger, in the early 1950s, proposed what he called social comparison theory, arguing that people evaluate their own abilities, opinions, and circumstances largely by comparing themselves against other people, rather than through any purely internal or absolute standard. Festinger's original research focused mainly on how people resolve uncertainty about their own opinions and abilities by checking them against similar others. Later research extended the theory to a specific and consequential asymmetry, a strong general tendency for that comparison to run upward, toward people who appear to be doing better, rather than downward, toward people who might genuinely be struggling more. This upward tilt made a certain evolutionary and social sense, in a world where the people most available for comparison were mostly neighbours and immediate community, a relatively narrow and locally grounded sample. Modern social media has expanded the available pool of upward comparison targets to an almost limitless scale, a constant, algorithmically curated stream of other people's best moments, filtered and selected specifically for their appeal, compared against the full, unfiltered, and necessarily more ordinary texture of a person's own actual daily life. Researchers studying the psychological effects of heavy social media use have repeatedly found associations between this kind of passive upward comparison and lower reported life satisfaction, distinct from other, more actively social uses of the same platforms. What makes the comparison particularly distorting is that it is rarely a fair one. The vacation photograph does not show the argument on the drive to the airport. The new home does not show the mortgage anxiety that came with it. The comparison, however sincerely felt, is being run against a highlight reel rather than against another full, equally complicated life. The classmate scrolling through their own feed that same evening is very likely doing precisely the same thing, comparing their own full, ordinary life against someone else's curated highlights, and feeling, for a few idle minutes, exactly the same quiet, misplaced deficit. A person takes a job mainly because it was the first offer to arrive during a stretch of financial pressure, with little real deliberation involved beyond needing an income. Ask that same person a year later why they chose the job, and the answer that comes back is rarely a plain account of financial pressure and timing. It is, more often, a considered story about mission, growth and fit, a narrative constructed well after the actual decision that bears only a loose resemblance to the circumstances that produced it. This kind of retroactive story building is one of the practical consequences of cognitive dissonance, a concept introduced by psychologist Leon Festinger in 1957 to describe the mental discomfort that arises when a person holds two inconsistent ideas at once, in this case, an action taken largely out of necessity and a self-image, as someone who makes thoughtful, values-driven decisions. That discomfort does not sit well, and the mind, rather than tolerating the inconsistency indefinitely, tends to resolve it by quietly revising one of the two conflicting elements, almost always the belief rather than the already completed action, since the action itself cannot be undone. Festinger's original and most famous demonstration of the effect involved participants paid either a small or a large sum of money to perform a tedious task and then lie to the next participant, claiming the task had actually been enjoyable. Counterintuitively, the participants paid the smaller sum for the lie later rated the task as having been genuinely more enjoyable than the participants paid the larger sum. The larger payment gave those participants an easy external justification for their dishonesty. No internal belief needed adjusting. The smaller payment did not provide a sufficient external justification, so the participants' minds resolved the resulting discomfort internally instead by genuinely convincing themselves the boring task had not been so bad after all. The broader implication runs through a great deal of ordinary life. Decisions that begin as arbitrary, circumstantial, or simply convenient often acquire, over time, a far more coherent and flattering justification than the moment of the decision itself ever contained, not through deliberate dishonesty, but through a genuine, largely unconscious editing of the story to keep it consistent with how a person needs to see themselves. The job taken mainly for the paycheck has, a year later, become a career chosen for its mission. Nobody involved in that revision noticed it happening, least of all the person who lived it. A city bans a particular brand of laundry detergent after discovering it contains an ingredient with mild environmental concerns. In the months following the ban, sales and demand for that exact detergent, both in nearby unregulated areas and on the second-hand market within the city itself, rise sharply, well beyond what its previous unrestricted popularity would have predicted. The ban did not simply remove an option, it appears to have made that option more desirable than it ever was while freely available. This pattern was named psychological reactance by psychologist Jack Brem in 1966, describing the motivational drive that arises specifically when a person perceives a freedom of choice being threatened, restricted, or eliminated. Reactance theory proposes that people place genuine value on the sense of freely choosing among available options, and that a perceived threat to that freedom, a ban, a rule, a forceful demand, triggers a motivational pushback that can increase desire for the restricted option, increase resistance to the restricting authority, or both at once, independent of the actual merits of the restricted option itself. The effect helps explain a familiar dynamic in parenting, where a flatly forbidden activity often gains an appeal it never had while simply available and unremarkable, and in marketing, where phrases explicitly warning of limited availability or an approaching deadline reliably increase purchase intent, deliberately manufacturing a small, artificial version of the same threatened freedom that produces genuine reactance in less engineered settings. It helps explain why public health warnings, when phrased in a way that feels overly forceful or restrictive rather than informative, sometimes produce a measurable backlash effect among exactly the audience the warning was meant to persuade. Research on effective persuasion has found that messages framed around preserving a person's sense of autonomous choice, here are your options, rather than around removing choice entirely, you must not, tend to produce considerably less reactance and, correspondingly, better actual compliance with whatever the underlying goal happened to be. The detergent banned by that city ordinance was never, by most objective measures, in especially high demand before the ban existed. The ban itself did the advertising the product had never needed to do on its own. In a long-term marriage, each partner will often say, with complete sincerity, some version of the same claim, that they understand their spouse better than their spouse understands them. Both partners cannot simultaneously be correct about this in any strict sense, and yet the belief persists comfortably on both sides at once, each person quietly convinced their own read on the other runs deeper than the other's read on them. This asymmetry has a formal name, the illusion of asymmetric insight, studied by psychologist Emily Pronin and colleagues, who found the pattern extending well beyond marriages into friendships, workplace relationships, and even conflicts between opposing political or social groups. Each side in a disagreement tends to believe it sees clearly into the psychology and true motivations of the other side, while believing the other side's understanding of its own psychology and motivations remains comparatively shallow or distorted. Pronin's explanation traced the asymmetry back to a basic difference in the kind of evidence each person has access to about themselves versus about others. A person's own inner life, thoughts, private doubts, hidden motivations, and the reasoning behind their own choices feels rich, detailed, and directly accessible from the inside. Another person's inner life, by contrast, can only ever be inferred indirectly, from behavior, tone, and expression, never observed directly. This creates a strange but consistent asymmetry, where a person's confidence in their read on someone else can feel just as strong as their confidence in their read on themselves, even though the underlying evidence available for each read is wildly different in quality and depth. The illusion carries a specific cost in conflict, since each side, believing it already understands the other's true motives with reasonable accuracy, has less incentive to actually ask, and more incentive to simply explain the other side's behavior using whatever motives seem most plausible from the outside, motives that may bear little resemblance to what the other side would report about themselves if genuinely asked. The two partners, each certain of a deeper insight into the other than the other holds into them, are not lying to each other. They are each, in their own way, mistaking the vividness of their own private guessing for something closer to actual knowledge. In a series of experiments conducted by psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, participants were shown a simulated car accident and later asked questions about it, with one subtle variation planted deliberately into the wording. Some participants were asked how fast the car was going when it smashed into another vehicle. Others were asked the identical question, but with a gentler verb, how fast the car was going when it merely hit the other vehicle. The participants asked about the car that smashed reported higher speed estimates, and more strikingly, were also more likely to later report having seen broken glass at the scene of the accident. There had been no broken glass in the footage at all. This phenomenon, which Loftus went on to study extensively across a long and influential research career, is known as the misinformation effect, describing how a person's memory of a past event can be genuinely altered, not merely embellished in the retelling but actually reshaped in storage, by exposure to suggestive information encountered after the original event took place. Memory, Loftus' research made clear, does not function as a fixed recording, replayed unchanged each time it is accessed. It is, instead, reconstructed anew each time it is recalled, and each reconstruction is vulnerable to influence from whatever information happens to be available at the moment of recall, including information that was never actually part of the original event. The implications of this research have proven significant well beyond the psychology laboratory. Loftus' work has been cited extensively in legal contexts involving eyewitness testimony, since a witness questioned using leading or suggestive language can develop a sincere, confident, and entirely false memory of details, that a more neutral line of questioning would never have introduced. Confidence in a memory, her research repeatedly demonstrated, correlates only weakly with the accuracy of that memory, a finding with serious consequences for a justice system that has historically placed considerable weight on a confident, detailed eyewitness account. The broken glass those participants remembered, with genuine sincerity and real conviction, never actually existed anywhere, except in the small suggestive verb a researcher had chosen to plant in a question asked after the fact. Asked to rate, on a simple numerical scale, how well they understand how a common bicycle actually works, most people give themselves a fairly confident rating. Then asked to actually draw the chain, pedals, and gears in a way that would let the bicycle function correctly. A striking number of these same confident people produce diagrams with the chain connected incorrectly, or missing entirely the mechanical link between pedaling and the rear wheel turning. The confident rating and the actual, demonstrated understanding turn out to have very little to do with each other. This gap was studied and named by psychologists Leonid Rosenblit and Frank Kyle, who called the pattern the illusion of explanatory depth. Their research found that people consistently and substantially overestimate how well they understand the mechanisms behind everyday devices, natural phenomena, and even their own political positions, right up until they are actually asked to explain the mechanism in detailed step-by-step terms, at which point the confident feeling of understanding collapses considerably faster than most people expect it to. The explanation Rosenblit and Kale propose centers on a mismatch between two different kinds of familiarity. People are, in fact, quite good at recognizing a device, naming its function, and describing what it generally does, and that fluent, easy recognition gets mistaken for a deeper mechanistic understanding of how it actually produces that function, an understanding that requires considerably more specific, effortful knowledge than mere recognition provides. The illusion tends to be far weaker, notably, for narratives and simple facts, which people can generally judge their own understanding of fairly accurately, and far stronger specifically for mechanisms and processes where the gap between recognition and genuine comprehension runs deepest. The illusion has been shown to extend into public policy attitudes as well. Later research found that asking people to explain, in careful mechanistic detail, exactly how a policy they hold a strong opinion about would actually work tends to noticeably soften the confidence and extremity of that opinion, apparently because the exercise exposes to the person holding the opinion just how much of their confident understanding was resting on a felt sense of understanding rather than an actual, examined one. The bicycle, drawn-out chain and all, revealed something its confident owner had never actually noticed before being asked to draw it, that understanding something well enough to use it every day is not the same as understanding it well enough to explain it. Two colleagues leave the same meeting with entirely different accounts of what was decided, each one fully convinced their own account is simply what happened. An objective record of the meeting rather than one interpretation of it among several possible ones. Neither colleague believes they are offering an opinion. Each believes they are reporting a fact, and each is quietly baffled, even a little offended, that the other could see the same meeting so differently. This pattern is called naive realism, a term used by social psychologists including Lee Ross to describe the deep, largely unexamined assumption that one's own perception of reality is direct, objective and unmediated, simply the world as it actually is, rather than one particular construction of it, shaped by attention, memory, prior belief and mood, among many other filtering forces a person rarely notices operating on their own perception in real time. The consequence that follows from this assumption is significant, and it shapes disagreement in a specific, predictable direction. If a person genuinely believes their own view of a situation is simply objective reality, then anyone who disagrees with that view cannot, from the naive realist perspective, simply be working from a different, equally legitimate vantage point. They must instead be misinformed, biased by some hidden agenda, or acting in bad faith, since the alternative, that reality itself might reasonably look different depending on where a person is standing, is rarely considered as a live possibility. Ross research found this pattern intensifying disagreements across political and ideological divides specifically, since each side, confident its own reading of events is simply accurate and unfiltered, tends to interpret the other side's disagreement not as a legitimate difference in perspective, but as evidence of the other side's dishonesty, ignorance, or hostility. an interpretation that escalates conflict considerably faster than an honest acknowledgement of differing perspectives ever would. The two colleagues, still convinced weeks later that their own account of the meeting was simply what occurred, will very likely never resolve their disagreement, not because either one is lying, but because neither one has considered that their own memory might be exactly as filtered and constructed as the other's. A person who accepted a job well below their ambitions during a difficult financial stretch tells themselves at the time that it is temporary, a stopgap they will leave within a year or two once circumstances improve. 10 years later they are still there. Asked how it happened, they struggle to identify a single moment of decision, because there was not one. There was only a long, gradual quiet, in which the discomfort that once made the job feel intolerable, slowly, imperceptibly, stopped registering as discomfort at all. This is habituation, the general process by which a nervous system reduces its response to a stimulus that persists unchanged over time. It is, in most contexts, a genuinely useful adaptation, the reason a ticking clock or a humming refrigerator fades from conscious awareness after the first few minutes in a room, freeing attention for things that actually still require it. Applied to a job, a relationship, or a living situation that no longer fits, the same mechanism produces something considerably less useful. A quiet erosion of exactly the discomfort that once served as an early, honest warning that something needed to change. Each of the traps described across this list plays some part in keeping that erosion invisible while it happens. Loss aversion makes leaving feel riskier than staying, regardless of how staying is actually going. The planning fallacy keeps the promised exit always just one more manageable stretch away. Cognitive dissonance quietly rewrites the story of why the choice was made in the first place into something more flattering than a stopgap taken out of necessity. Status quo bias needs no argument at all, only the simple gravitational fact that changing anything requires an active decision that staying does not. None of these traps are new information by the time they reach a person's 50th year inside a room that has stopped feeling small. What changes for the people who do eventually leave is rarely a sudden burst of willpower. It is usually a single small external jolt, loud enough to briefly override the habituation, that lets the original size of the room become visible again, if only for a moment. The room, whatever room it is, was never actually the size it came to feel. It only stopped being noticed, the way most things eventually do, once staying inside it became the most familiar thing left. 50 traps and not one of them requires a villain. That may be the strangest part of sitting with a list like this, that so much of what quietly narrows a life turns out to be the ordinary, well-intentioned architecture of an ordinary mind, doing more or less what it evolved to do, in a world that no longer quite matches the one it was built for. Nobody chooses to overweight a loss, or to mistake a familiar option for a good one, or to remember a criticism louder than 9 pieces of praise. It simply happens quietly underneath the level where choosing occurs. Knowing the name of a trap does not switch it off. A person who has just learned about the sunk cost fallacy will, in all likelihood, still finish the graduate program, still keep the failing stock a little longer than the numbers justify, still stay in the job that stopped fitting years ago. Awareness buys something smaller than a cure, and probably more useful than one, a moment of recognition, arriving sometimes a little late, that lets a person ask a slightly different question than the one their mind was about to answer on autopilot. Is this decision actually serving me? Or am I only protecting a story I have already told myself about who I am? There is a kind of relief available in this material that is easy to miss on a first pass through it. Feeling stuck is not, most of the time, a referendum on intelligence or character. It is closer to a symptom, a predictable output of specific, well-documented mechanisms operating exactly as they were built to operate, on decisions that mechanism was never really designed to handle well in the first place. That does not make the traps harmless. It makes them at least less personal. Somewhere right now, someone is holding onto a stock a little too long, or avoiding an envelope, or defending a decision they only ever made because it was convenient at the time. They are not doing anything unusual. They are doing what 50 different, well-studied mechanisms will predictably produce in almost anyone, given the right circumstances and enough time for habituation to quietly do its work. The traps do not close. They simply get a little easier to notice once you know approximately where to look.